May 1945. Dresden was a graveyard still smoldering under its own sky. A woman in her 30s, wrapped in a burnt shawl, walked among the ruins of her street searching for something to bury, perhaps a wedding ring, perhaps the shadow of her husband lost in the firestorm. She saw an American soldier step carefully over the rubble, his boots too clean for a place that smelled of death and wet ash. Without thinking, she spat at him. The saliva hit the leather and darkened it like rain. The soldier didn't raise his weapon. He only looked at her, nodded once, and walked away. The next morning, as the fog crawled out of the Elbe River, he returned. In his hands was a dented metal bowl, steaming. She hesitated, certain it was a trick, but he said, in slow, broken words, "Your husband would have done the same for mine." She stared at him, this boy from another world whose uniform bore the same olive color that had bombed her city. And for a long moment, neither moved. Then she took the bowl. That small act was the beginning of what no propaganda had prepared them for. Compassion, sneaking through the cracks of ruin. All across occupied Germany, encounters like this unfolded in silence. Rough hands offering bread to those who had once cursed them. Soldiers sharing rations not as conquerors, but as men who missed home. The war had taught them to hate, but the hunger after war taught them something harder: to forgive. Dresden had lost over 25,000 lives in the February bombings, more than any single night in its 1,000-year history. Entire districts were erased. Women, widowed overnight, made up nearly 1 in 3 households in Germany. Their black dresses became the new uniform of the nation. Yet amid the ashes, the first gestures of humanity appeared not from speeches or treaties, but from hands trembling over a bowl of soup. Historians would later call this the thaw of empathy, the instant when civilians and occupiers saw each other not as sides, but as survivors. The woman never learned the soldier's name. She only remembered that he returned every few days, leaving food at her door, never speaking again. When she finally found her husband's wedding ring under a collapsed beam, she placed it next to the empty bowl. To her, they both symbolized the same truth. Love was fragile, but kindness could survive even total destruction. As the bells of the ruined Frauenkirche tolled faintly for the first time since the surrender, the air carried no cheers, only the quiet realization that the war had ended not when the guns stopped, but when one widow accepted a bowl of soup from the man she once hated. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there tonight. In the first winter after surrender, the streets of Frankfurt, Cologne, and Dresden turned gray not only with soot, but with silence. They called them Trümmerfrauen, the streets of rubble. Rows of faceless buildings stood like broken teeth, and everywhere were women in black scarves, hauling bricks and wheelbarrows, their faces hollow, their steps measured. 1 in every 3 German households was now headed by a widow. Almost half of all men born between 1900 and 1910 were dead or missing. What remained of the nation stood on the backs of women who had lost everything but the will to stand. The Allied soldiers who entered these cities came not as heroes, but as witnesses to devastation. In Munich, an American engineer named Sergeant Raymond Cole wrote in his journal, "They call this victory, but the only victory I see is the sight of a woman lifting a stone heavier than herself, trying to make a wall that will not fall again." He and his unit were assigned to rebuild water stations. In the process, they met dozens of widows who came daily to fetch water. Some brought jam, some brought silence. A few even tried to offer jewelry in exchange for clean drinking water. The soldiers refused payment. They built pumps, repaired roofs, and bartered cigarettes for labor instead of submission. The gossip of the rubble women traveled faster than any newspaper. "The Americans smell of soap," one said. "They give you coffee if you smile," another replied. Soon, entire neighborhoods began to transform. Windows once shattered by bombs now glowed faintly at night, powered by makeshift cables the soldiers had installed. A strange cooperation began. Not friendship, not yet, but something that felt like a fragile truce between hunger and guilt. Statistically, by mid-1946, nearly 70% of urban reconstruction crews were made up of women over 35. They were widows, mothers, daughters, and grandmothers. They stacked 400 million bricks across Germany by hand, without cranes, without pay at first, driven by a word they rarely said aloud, Würde, dignity. One of them, named Ilse Meyer from Kassel, was photographed smiling faintly as she passed a pail of cement to a U.S. corporal. Years later, she said, "It was the first time in years a man looked at me without command or pity. Not all welcomed this fragile peace." Some German men returning from prisoner camps sneered at these women for serving the enemy. Yet the women knew that rebuilding was not betrayal, it was survival. They had seen enough death to know that hate could not lay bricks. By the end of 1946, 40% of Germany's public works projects were sustained through civilian Allied cooperation. It was not written in any treaty, not taught in any school, but the truth lingered in every rebuilt wall. Peace was not declared, it was constructed. And in those gray streets where widows worked beside foreign soldiers, you could already sense the quiet beginning of something no one dared name. A peace made not by generals or ministers, but by hands that had learned to rebuild out of grief. The sewing room smelled of oil, soap, and silence. Inside the former Wehrmacht barracks near Kassel, 20 women sat behind old Singer machines, their feet pressing pedals salvaged from wrecked factories. On the table lay a pile of torn uniforms, not gray, but olive drab, belonging to American soldiers wounded in the last months of the war. Among the women was a widow named Marta Vogel, who had lost her husband in Stalingrad and her son during the evacuation of Königsberg. Her hands trembled at first. She had sewn for officers once, and now she was stitching for the men who had defeated them. An American sergeant named William Harris from Michigan stopped by every afternoon to check on repairs. He had lost his left hand at the Battle of the Bulge and carried his sleeve pinned neatly at the elbow. The first time he saw Marta struggling to thread the needle, he steadied her hand with his one good one. She didn't flinch. "It fits just right," he said later, smiling as she adjusted his newly mended jacket. "Like peace." Those words lingered longer than the hum of the machines. In that room, thread became a kind of diplomacy. The widows were paid not in marks, but in ration tickets. 5 cigarettes, a can of corned beef, or a bar of American soap for every 10 repairs. It was more than they earned in any German workshop. Some whispered that working for the Americans was betrayal. Others whispered that it was survival. The gossip that swirled through the sewing room was half rumor, half confession. One woman said an American mechanic had taught her to fix the motor of her machine. Another said she had received a letter, not from her dead husband, but from the corporal whose shirt she had mended 3 times. Each story carried both shame and hope, and no one dared to name which was stronger. By the summer of 1946, more than 200 women's employment units had been established by U.S. occupation forces across Germany. Nearly 20,000 German women worked under Allied supervision in these makeshift factories, producing everything from uniforms to bed linens for hospitals. What began as labor turned into quiet exchange. They shared jokes about buttons and fabric, traded recipes, even learned a few English words. Coffee, good, tomorrow. In one surviving diary entry, Marta wrote, "I used to sew for pride, now I sew for peace. The fabric doesn't care who wears it." She kept that notebook hidden under her mattress for years, afraid her neighbors would call her a collaborator. But history, like stitching, binds opposites together. The sound of sewing machines in those barracks was not the echo of surrender. It was the rhythm of rebuilding. The women sewed until their fingers bled, yet they were no longer powerless. Every thread they pulled tied one more invisible knot between enemies who were learning, painfully, to share the same silence. And when the sergeant left Kassel in late 1946, he gave Marta his old patch, the one he'd worn through the Ardennes, and said, "Maybe one day we'll both forget how to sew uniforms." By 1947, the world had moved on to speeches about recovery and democracy, but for thousands of German widows, love was still contraband. The U.S. Army's non-fraternization policy remained in force, forbidding relationships between occupation soldiers and German civilians. To be caught kissing, or even sharing a private walk, could mean court-martial for him and public shame for her. Yet love, like hunger, never obeys orders. In Stuttgart, in a small cafe rebuilt from salvaged timber, a widow named Liesel Reinhardt met a corporal from Illinois who came daily for coffee and ration cakes. They spoke in broken words, mostly gestures. He once drew a heart on the corner of a napkin, then tore it in two and pocketed one half. From that day, every evening at the same table, he would slide her small, folded notes written on Red Cross stationery. One of them survived in an archive decades later. "We are not allowed to love, so we write like prisoners who found the key." Across the ruins of Germany, thousands of such letters crossed the invisible front lines between guilt and forgiveness. Postal officers intercepted some, censored others. But many survived, hidden in hymn books, beneath floorboards, or smuggled through friendly translators. These correspondences became the secret arteries of a new kind of peace, one written in ink rather than blood. The numbers were staggering. Between 1945 and 1948, more than 85,000 German women were investigated for fraternization, and over 950 American soldiers faced disciplinary action for improper relations. Yet for every punished pair, dozens more continued their quiet defiance. They met at makeshift dances in barracks, where gramophones played swing records left behind from before the war. German women wore patched dresses. American men offered chocolate bars as tickets of affection. In Berlin, a British military policeman recalled seeing a crowd part suddenly when a German woman clung to a uniformed man in public, whispering, "Don't let them send you away." It wasn't lust that frightened the onlookers. It was the unbearable sight of tenderness between supposed enemies. For the widows, these relationships weren't always romance. They were, at first, survival, warmth in the ruins, safety at night, a hand that didn't strike. But for some, affection grew quietly. A few officers sent packages of powdered milk for children who weren't theirs. Some even wrote to the U.S. Congress begging for permission to marry. When the ban finally lifted in late 1947, the first approved marriages read like miracles. Photographs from Frankfurt show women in borrowed white dresses, holding flowers cut from gardens the soldiers had replanted. A generation raised to salute flags now learned to raise glasses at weddings, unthinkable just 2 years earlier. Those letters, once hidden under floorboards, became keepsakes read aloud to grandchildren decades later. In them lay the confession of a generation that had survived not by forgetting the war, but by writing their way out of it. The war ended, but its shadows were born anew in the faces of children who didn't know which flag to salute. Between 1946 and 1947, over 66,000 babies were registered across the American, British, and French occupation zones whose fathers were foreign soldiers. Newspapers called them Besatzungskinder, children of the occupation. In villages from Bremen to Würzburg, whispers followed every birth. "His eyes look American," or "Her hair is too dark to be German." The widows who had once buried husbands now faced judgment for bringing life. In a small apartment near Nuremberg, a boy named Emil sat on the floor playing with a tin soldier missing one leg. His mother, Anna Weiss, had lost her husband on the Eastern Front and worked as a cleaner at the Allied canteen. An American corporal named Joseph Turner had once lent her soap and later shared his rations. Their quiet companionship turned to something unspoken, something human. When Emil was born, neighbors turned their backs. The priest refused baptism until the truth of his father was declared. One afternoon, when the corporal returned to say goodbye before being reassigned home, Emil looked at him with solemn eyes and asked, "Was my daddy your enemy?" The room froze. The man knelt, smiled faintly, and said, "Only until the day you were born." That answer, recorded later in Anna's letter to her sister, captured the paradox of a generation, when the children of former enemies became proof that mercy could be inherited. In the statistics, Germany's moral landscape looked grim. Nearly 20,000 fraternization cases prosecuted, thousands of women dismissed from government jobs for dishonoring the nation, and countless children labeled illegitimate. Yet beneath those numbers lay something unquantifiable, a slow rebellion of the heart. Many widows refused to apologize for love. They wrote petitions demanding recognition for their children, arguing that peace without forgiveness breeds only orphans. American relief officers, initially strict, began to soften. By 1948, charitable organizations shipped powdered milk, baby clothes, and even toys to mixed families. In Hamburg, U.S. Army nurses adopted orphans left behind by departing soldiers. A few local newspapers began printing cautious stories titled "The New Families of Germany." Still, the gossip never stopped. In markets, women whispered that some widows traded shame for sugar, yet others whispered differently, that those same women had restored the meaning of humanity when the rest of the world had lost it. Historians now agree that these children changed the perception of the occupation more profoundly than any speech or reconstruction plan. They were living proof that compassion had crossed the line no treaty could. Would you forgive love born from the ashes of war? Would you judge a mother who chose tenderness over loneliness? Tell us what you think. Not as historians, but as people who still believe the heart has its own memory. By 1948, the bans had lifted, and what was once a forbidden whisper became the sound of suitcases closing. More than 15,000 German women applied for permission to marry Allied soldiers. Their neighbors watched in silence as they left through ports in Bremen and Hamburg, dressed in second-hand coats carrying love letters wrapped in ration paper. The American authorities issued what they called war bride visas, and soon, passenger ships filled with women who had once swept rubble now crossed the Atlantic, heading not toward conquest, but toward uncertain peace. One of them was Martha Vogel, the seamstress from Kassel. After months of letters, Sergeant William Harris sent her a ticket to Michigan. She waited 2 weeks for approval, terrified the papers would be revoked. When she finally boarded the SS Marine Flasher in May 1948, she carried only 2 things: her husband's ring and the patch the sergeant had left her 2 years before. On deck, dozens of women huddled together, whispering English phrases they had practiced. "Thank you. Home tomorrow." Behind them, the coast of a wounded country disappeared into fog. The statistics were astonishing for a nation still grieving. 13,000 marriages between German women and U.S. soldiers by 1950, another 3,500 with British and French servicemen. Many of those brides arrived in America to towns that had never seen a German woman before. Newspaper headlines ranged from curiosity to condemnation. One Iowa paper wrote, "Enemy brides land in New York." Yet among those crowds of spectators stood veterans' mothers handing flowers, saying softly, "Welcome home." In Detroit, Marta's first letter back to Kassel described her astonishment at supermarkets where bread came sliced, where lights never went out. "It feels like living inside a dream that smells of gasoline and peace," she wrote. "I still wake expecting to hear the siren." Her neighbors in Germany passed her letter around like scripture, proof that beyond ruins there was life. Some brides struggled. A few faced suspicion. Others, language barriers, homesickness, and rejection from families who could not forgive. But most adapted quietly. They found work in hospitals, shops, and schools, raising children who spoke 2 languages and carried 2 loyalties. In 1949, the first reunion of German war brides was held in Chicago. One of them joked, "We are the peace treaty that learned to bake." Laughter followed, weary, grateful laughter that meant survival. The marriages did more than unite hearts. They softened entire nations. In less than 5 years, Germany shifted from enemy to ally. Economists point to the Marshall Plan, historians point to diplomacy. But in truth, peace often began at a kitchen table where a German woman poured American coffee for her husband's mother. Do you think love can rebuild nations faster than treaties? Can kindness do what politics never could? Leave your thoughts below, because sometimes history begins with a single yes. In a small village near Hesse, spring came softly in 1958. The war had been over for 13 years, yet the smell of gun oil still haunted barns and cellars. In the village cemetery stood a modest grave marked not by rank or regiment, but by 2 small flags. One German, one American. The wind tangled their cloth like 2 hands, refusing to let go. The locals called it the grave with 2 hearts. It belonged to Anna Weiss, the widow who had once asked forgiveness for loving a man the world called her enemy. Her story was known only through fragments. A diary left in a drawer, a photograph of a child smiling beside a Jeep, and a rumor that every Christmas she sent a single white rose to America. Her son, Emil, now 12, tended the grave each week. On the tombstone beneath the flags, the words were simple: "Enemies once, widowed forever, at peace together." By then, the statistics had faded into textbooks. Over 66,000 children of mixed heritage, 13,000 war brides, millions of tons of rubble, cleared by the hands of widows. But behind those numbers were stories that refused to die. Letters that still smelled of ink and soap, stitched uniforms preserved in trunks, faded recipes shared between women and soldiers who had discovered that mercy could be cooked, written, and worn. In the nearby town of Fulda, historians collecting oral testimonies found something unexpected. Many of the widows who had married foreign soldiers described not romance first, but relief. Relief from the endless silence of mourning. One woman said, "He listened when I spoke of the dead. No German man ever asked again." Another confessed that she fell in love because he didn't look away from the ruins inside me. These women were not heroines in the cinematic sense. They were builders of invisible bridges. Each gesture, a bowl of soup, a mended jacket, a letter smuggled through checkpoints, was an act of rebellion against the cruelty of memory. And in that rebellion, a new identity was born, the widow who dared to forgive before the nation did. Emil grew up visiting that grave until he was old enough to leave for America, where he worked as a translator. In a 1972 interview, he said, "People asked if I was German or American. I always answered, I am my mother's piece." His words, quiet and sure, carried the echo of 1,000 untold reconciliations. Today, the cemetery in Hesse still keeps that small grave. Tourists rarely find it, but the locals sometimes leave poppies and cornflowers. Red and blue, two colors once divided by uniforms. When the wind passes through the flags, they ripple together, whispering a language older than war and softer than victory. And somewhere beyond the fields, the ghosts of widows and soldiers rest, not as conquerors or victims, but as people who learned too late that compassion is the only empire worth keeping. History often remembers battles more vividly than the peace that followed. Yet sometimes, the truest revolutions occur not in parliaments or treaties, but in kitchens, sewing rooms, and letters passed hand to hand. The widows of post-war Germany were never the architects of power, but they became the quiet engineers of reconciliation. They built no monuments, but their gestures, a bowl of soup, a patch of cloth, a child's smile, outlasted every speech about victory. When we speak of peace, we often imagine generals shaking hands, cities rebuilt, and flags raised high. But real peace is quieter. It is a widow forgiving the pilot who once bombed her home. It is an American soldier teaching a German child how to pronounce hope. It is the realization that humanity, when stripped of uniform and anthem, still yearns to be seen, to be forgiven, to be touched without fear. The widows of Germany did not fall in love with their occupiers. They fell in love with the possibility of life again. Their stories remind us that forgiveness is not weakness, but endurance, and that the cost of compassion is often misunderstanding. They lived through hunger and humiliation, yet found gentleness in the very people they were told to despise. Today, their names are mostly forgotten, but their legacy endures wherever former enemies choose understanding over pride. The grave with two flags still stands in Hesse, quietly defying time. Each spring, the flowers bloom there first, as if the earth itself remembers what the world tried to forget. History, when stripped of its uniforms and medals, is nothing more than a long conversation between those who hurt and those who choose to heal. The widows of Germany answered that conversation with courage, and in doing so, taught the world that even among ashes, the heart can rebuild.